Trump blatantly declared war on the old world order, which was the output of 40 years of neoliberal globalization. And when we say it like that, it still sounds pretty good, if we don't consider that the new model that he offers closely resembles the era of inter-imperialist conflicts that led us straight to 2 world wars, and that Trump's second debut starts with an avalanche of unprecedented gifts to US giant corporations, which will have to be financed by taxing the rest of the planet in different ways. The fact that the unprecedented wealth of the US oligarchies is financed by the rest of the world is not something new. On the contrary, it is the very foundation of what we call super-imperialism. The outskirts of the empire produce what they export, and they are forced to receive payments in dollars. And then those dollars largely end up in the US financial market bubble. And while the American middle class is becoming poorer because there are no more jobs in industry, a very small oligarchy is accumulating an unprecedented amount of wealth. Just take a look at the ranking of the 10 richest men on the planet. In 2007, they had assets for around 350 billion, and only 3 of them were from the United States. Now, in that special top 10, only 1 billionaire is not American, and the total assets have multiplied by more than 5 times, exceeding 1.8 trillions. A treasure which is composed to a very large extent of shares on the stock markets. And the value of those stocks is inflated beyond measure by the fact that those around the world who continue to produce and accumulate dollars are basically forced to use these dollars to go shopping on the US stock exchanges. Starting from the money managed directly by assets management giants such as BlackRock and Vanguard, who manage 20,000 billion in savings coming from all over the planet. By far, the largest monetary mass in hands of individual private groups in the entire history of capitalism. Used to buy majority stakes in all the main companies listed on the US markets. Given this systematic robbery that has transferred a massive part of global wealth from the bottom to the top, and from the periphery to the center of the empire, what can Trump do to make American billionaires great again that hasn't already been done in the past? The point is that this model, even though it continues to plunder boundless wealth, is living a disruptive crisis. The main factor that determined that crisis were the emerging powers, which, unlike the so-called allies of the USA, who in reality are more vassals than allies, decided to start challenging the world order founded on the dictatorship of the dollar. It is not the first time that it happens. Even in the past, there have been countries or groups of countries that have tried to raise their hands. Saddam Hussein's Iraq did it, even with the decision to sell its oil in euros instead of dollars. Muammar Gaddafi's Libya did it, trying to create a new African sovereign currency. We all know how it ended. The problem here is forcing the Russian Federation and China to suffer the same fate as Libya and Iraq might not be that simple. US-led imperialism knows this and has tried somewhat more sophisticated strategies than plain military aggression. 2 forms of hybrid warfare: the proxy war against Russia starting from Ukraine, and the boycott of technological development against China, for now. Both of them, to put it mildly, are not exactly producing the desired results so far. In short, the empire, with the tools it has got in its hands today, does not seem to be able to neutralize the existential threats to the survivor of its system, totally dependent on the monopoly of the USA and the dollar on the global financial architecture. Hence, the need to rebuild a deterrence capable of dissuading adversaries from persisting with their threats to the global order. This, in short, means having to rebuild an industrial base sufficient to avoid having to consider a possible and probably inevitable direct conflict as lost from the outset. Since the last century, industrial production has determined the outcome of a traditional conflict between 2 powers of equal technological level. And today, there is only one major manufacturing superpower in the world, the People's Republic of China, which alone produces about 1/3 of the manufactured goods consumed every year on the entire planet. After the drunkenness of hyper-financialization since the first Trump administration, Get to reduce this gap has become one of the absolute priorities of US politics, regardless of their political orientation. The first Trump administration tried the path of a trade and tariffs war with China, but with limited success. The Biden administration has tried the route of billion-dollar incentives to those who decided to return with their production in the US. But even in this case, industrial production has only continued to decline. In the meantime, in both cases, the firepower of the asset management giants continued to grow inexorably, going from barely 10,000 billion in January 2017 to the current almost 20,000. In the same period of time, the net financial position of the United States, which represents the difference between financial assets held abroad and liability towards foreign countries, tripled, going from 8,000 billion to over 23,000. Public debt then went from less than 105% to over 120%, just as interest rates continued to rise. The result? Interest expenditure alone went from just over 450 billion to almost 900 in 2024, even exceeding military spending for the first time. Numbers against the idea of the healthy economy pictured by Atlanticist propaganda in recent years, based solely on the GDP growth indicator, that is totally inadequate to describe the real state of health of a hyper-financialized economy like the US. The unsustainability blatantly demonstrated by these indicators is then added to the contradictions that come from the choice to have the dollar transform into a weapon. Especially since the decision to freeze 300 billion Russian assets, every country on the planet has realized that holding assets in dollars is now a huge risk. Luckily for Washington, the rest of the world has not yet equipped itself with financial institutions capable of allowing those who accumulate large trade surpluses to find alternatives investment channels to the adequate US financial markets. But this gap, as everyone can understand, cannot last forever. The failure during the last two administrations to reserve the long process that has seen gigantic amounts of wealth move from the productive economy to financial speculation over the last half-century is not simply the outcome of their incompetence. The problem is that whoever governs the USA faces a structural contradiction that is basically unsolvable. On the one hand, to maintain the role of the dollar as a global currency of exchange and reserve, they need a strong and stable dollar and high interest rates. On the other hand, to reindustrialize the United States, they need a weaker dollar and lower interest rates. On the basis of the inevitable failure of the last 8 years, Trump 2.0, if he really aims to stop the US decline, cannot just retry the old receipts, even if with a little more awareness and determination. The United States needs a real revolution in the accumulation mechanism that keeps the whole thing afloat, similar in scope to that which began 50 years ago with the end of the gold standard and the beginning of what we could define as the great neoliberal counter-revolution. But what will be the pillars of this new revolution within the US oligarchic capitalism? As always, the final outcome is actually quite unpredictable. What we can do is try to line up some of the main elements that emerged since Donald Trump literally disintegrated the old democratic establishment in the last election. The first point is that despite all the announcements and threats, and despite his administration's record about the amount of executive orders within a few hours of the president's inauguration, the tariffs have still not arrived. In the past months, many have underlined how a policy based on tariffs would most likely be unsustainable, starting from the negative consequences for inflation. According to the analysts who have raised these doubts, the duties will be limited to some specific target sectors, while the threat of generalized duties will be nothing more than a tactic to obtain more advantageous conditions for agreements. If threats are the stick, however, Trump has also pulled out a fair amount of carrots from his arsenal. For anyone who decides to invest in the US, Trump promises not only the ultra-favorable tax regime, but also wild deregulation, starting from the very expensive and hated environment rules. In short, goodbye India and Vietnam. According to Trump, the new China must be the United States, with one major difference. China was forced to roll out the red carpet for foreign investors to escape from underdevelopment and the consequences of over a century of colonialist pillage. Trump's US is rolling out red carpets for foreign investors to try to defend the US imperial dominion and the wide assets of the oligarchies close to the president. But transforming the US into the new China could be more complex than expected. The cost of labor in the United States is high, and containing it could be rather difficult. The first obstacles that Trump will face in his attempt to contain the increase in labor costs will be the promise he made and the first executive order he issued in terms of the fight against illegal immigration, which, with offshoring, has been one of the fundamental elements that allowed the US to contain inflation in the past. As for the rest, the strength of the dollar and the rush of all global capital to grab assets in dollars make the cost of living in the United States structurally incredibly high. Equally important, as it undermines the competitiveness of the entire country at its foundation, the almost total absence of the state in the essential services, from healthcare to education, which, in the hands of private oligopolies, have enormously higher costs than other countries. A large-scale process of generalized reindustrialization, therefore, seems rather unrealistic. But there could be a loophole: automation and artificial intelligence. While public opinion focused on the battle for leadership in generative AI, China continued to consolidate its leadership in implementing AI in industrial manufacturing, starting from the diffusion of very high-performance 5G technologies in the corporate sector, thanks also to the contribution of leading global companies in the telecommunications sector such as Huawei, which, despite the sanctions, have no equal in the United States. The implementation of artificial intelligence in industrial production in China is intended to coordinate and improve the efficiency of a huge number of industrial robots that have been introduced in recent years, unlike in the US. So, China has recently overtaken Germany in terms of the number of industrial robots used per 10,000 employees, which has reached over 470 compared to Germany's 430. The US is stuck at 295. And without any domestic producers capable of contributing to reduce this gigantic gap. But instead of proposing realistic solutions to recover this delay, which is evidently too technical and complex to set on fire the hearts of the MAGA movements and the headlines, Trump seems to bet everything on another type of AI, and it's not clear how it should help the US to overcome the bottlenecks that could hinder its reindustrialization process. We are obviously talking about Stargate, the public-private initiative announced by Trump himself the day after his inauguration, and which include investments for $500 billion for the creation of enormous data centers and all the material and immaterial infrastructures necessary to guarantee the USA leadership in the development of the most advanced AI models. Meanwhile, Trump immediately revoked the executive order issued by the Biden administration in 2023 that aimed to mitigate the risk associated with the development of AI, and which many criticized because they claimed it represented an obstacle in the competition with China for leadership. Trump also immediately enacted measures to further deregulate fossil fuel extraction in the hope of being able to provide more energy at lower costs, which is another of the main bottlenecks slowing down the development of the sector. The market reaction was enthusiastic. The shares of SoftBank, the Japanese financial holding company involved in Stargate, rose by almost 18% in 24 hours. The shares of Oracle, another Stargate partner, by 12%. Nvidia, which is not part of the consortium, but which would be obviously the main suppliers of chips, by more than 5%. But perhaps all this enthusiasm is not actually based on very solid foundations. The game of providing more energy at lower costs may not be so simple, since increasing the extraction of shale oil and gas through hydraulic fracturing becomes vastly more expensive and in turn energy intensive as reserves dwindle. In addition, it requires huge investments, which producers may not be so willing to support given the prospects of lower prices. Especially today that, despite Trump's hopes and the first timid hints by the Fed of cutting rates, the cost of money, instead of decreasing, continues to increase. The Stargate project might be less new than what people have tried to make us believe. The first data center has already been under construction for months, and the announcement was not actually accompanied by any additional new financial commitments. And it's not sure that the Biden administration's old executive order actually was a serious obstacle. Part of the order required various government agencies to study the impact of AI on virtually everything, from cybersecurity risks to effects on education. However, those studies are not completed, and the recommendation they produce will remain even after the revocation. The only aspect that could have some concrete consequences is the end of the obligation based on the Defense Production Act that obliged companies to share with the government the results of safety tests. Companies consider it an unnecessary bureaucratic burden and complained about it, but this may not be particularly meaningful. Wherever new requirement a government introduced, companies always complain. But in reality, nobody knows how this exchange of information worked, and most likely it represents more of an excuse than a real burden of any relevance. While it was certainly an additional tool to make the development of this new technology less anarchic and more sustainable. Well, all things considered, much ado about nothing. And this could be a paradigmatic example. Unable to find way out of the infinite contradiction created by 50 years of financial super-imperialism, Trumponomics risks being nothing else than an attempt to make the US the promised land of all the most unscrupulous oligarchies on the planet, in search of immediate profits based on nothing, but incapable of carrying out a structural transformation in order to guarantee the sustainability of the system in the medium to long term. The announcements and the speculative bubbles should be able to attract capital, but won't be enough to guarantee the US the necessary technological leadership, as demonstrated by another paradigmatic episode. It is the extraordinary success achieved by the Chinese developers of DeepSeek. The latest model developed by the Chinese startup called DeepSeek V3, in fact, seems to be superior to its Western commercial competitors in many respects. But it needed about a 20th of the resources to be trained, wildly reducing not only the financial resources required, but also energy consumption, and demonstrating how it is possible to circumvent US protectionism on the latest generation chips. But not only this. In fact, on the same day as Trump's inauguration, DeepSeek also released a leaner version called DeepSeek R1, which is completely open source. According to analysts, it would be the most advanced open source model ever, which means that many of the things that until today could only be obtained by paying a service to the US oligopoly, from tomorrow could be developed autonomously, even in countries with a serious delay. Even with regard to the need to re-establish the credibility of the dollar as a safe reserve currency, independent from the whims of temporary politicians, Trump does not seem able to provide the necessary reassurance. On the contrary, for months, Trump has been threatening to use brute force to annex new territories. Almost no one doubts that he will apply new sanctions every time a country clashes with his agenda, which he has already explicitly threatened to do. For example, if Putin refuses to sit down at a table on his terms. The only thing that could allow Trump's bizarre plan to save US capitalism once again is the total inconsistency of the ruling classes of vassal countries. From the headquarters of global capitalism in Davos, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, declared that, in the face of Trump's aggression, the European Union is finally ready to fight to prevent the capital of the old continent from continuing to flee overseas. Unfortunately, von der Leyen's devotion is directed more towards big capital than towards the general interests of the old continent. This means that it is prepared to implement only measures that do not limit the freedom of capital to migrate freely where the highest remuneration is ensured. In short, von der Leyen wants to challenge Trump exclusively on the terrain of who offers the best opportunities to get rich. But with an infinitely weaker currency, financial markets that are only a fraction of those of the United States, the total lack of a real geopolitical outreach and gigantic technological gap, the European Union is losing this game before even starting it. The only chance Europe has to avoid that, despite all the contradictions, Trumponomics translates into another gigantic hemorrhage of capital towards the other side of the Atlantic, is to definitively quit neoliberal dogmas and impose substantial limitation on the free movement of capital. The only chance Europe has to avoid that, despite all the contradictions, Trumponomics translates into another gigantic hemorrhage of capital towards the other side of the Atlantic, is to definitively quit neoliberal dogmas and impose substantial limitation on the free movement of capital. A possibility that, even just to think about it, requires at the very least a total change of the entire ruling class. Without this political earthquake, Europe is once again a candidate to save moribund US capitalism at the expenses of its citizens. Thanks for watching, I'm Diego and this is 99 Media. We are an Italian-based collective of independent journalists, philosophers, writers and artists whose goal is to create a media for the 99%. If you like this video, please like, share and subscribe, and also you may support our work by donate via PayPal or GoFundMe at the link below.